So Daniel Crouch is up next. I have been a fan of Daniel and his work for a number of years. He, with his partner Nick Trimming, run one of the most prestigious high-end map and rare book dealerships in the world. And I knew that when I stopped by Daniel's booth at the San Francisco Map Fair in September of 2018. And I didn't think he would have time to talk with me because I had just told him that the $25,000 map on the wall was way out of my league. But he nevertheless spent a good 30 minutes chatting with me and my wife, Eleanor, about old maps. And I remembered that distinctly when I asked him if he would talk today, and really appreciate him coming to talk with us. Daniel majored in philosophy and then worked at Bonhams and Bernard Shapiro Rare Books before starting Daniel Crouch Rare Books with his partner Nick 10 years ago. He lives in Oxford with his wife Jen and two young daughters. And if you want him to stay on track with his talk, don't ask him any questions about cricket. Daniel, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks very much indeed for having me. It's very rare that as an antiquarian book dealer, I get a chance to be as current as this. So I'm gonna relish the opportunity to be topical. And I'm going to talk about contagious cartography, a panorama of pandemics and plagues. So I'm just going to try and share my screen with you. Please tell me if this is working.
Yep.
Excellent.
With a stuff that the doctor called a flu. People were dying everywhere. Death was creeping all through the air, and the groan of the red sure was sad. Well, it was God's almighty plan. He is judging this old land, north and south, east and west. Well, it can't be seen. Well, a killer red and a killer pool. And it's gonna kill just a little more if you don't move from your shame.
So, as the lyrics say, death was creeping through the air, and it's going to kill even more if you don't turn away from your shame. So, most of the history of epidemiology has been a story of miasma versus man. Is it bad air or bad behavior that kills us? And the vocabulary of disease runs parallel with the language of place and space and cartography. We talk of spread, dispersal, distribution, global pandemics, and however inaccurately, the Spanish flu and the China virus. Indeed, the plague of Athens in 430 BC is often cited as the first recorded epidemic. Our view of disease can appear decidedly geographic. And the word pandemic has Greek origins. It comes from pan, meaning all, and demos, meaning people. This points the finger in altogether different direction. Whilst maps and data visualization can help track and understand disease, it's the action of people that determine its cause, its dissemination, and its cure. Even with the dissemination of germ theory at the end of the 19th century, we see that by mapping the story of disease and telling the story of mapping disease, that both the actions of pathogens and those of people can determine the cartography of contagion. And so here we see a skeleton of the earliest recorded death from the plague. It is 2000 BC in Buranovo in modern-day Russia. And this contains DNA from the bacterium Yersinia pestis, more friendly known as Black Death and bubonic plague. And this is the earliest sign of some form of epidemic. We don't know how far it spread. The earliest literary references, however, start with classical Greece. And here we see Apollo with his arrows, shooting the plague arrows. And indeed, the plague was visited upon the Greek camp at Troy to punish the Athenians for Agamemnon's enslavement of Chryseis. I've got a daughter who's obsessed with classical Greece at the moment, and it's led me to think that the parallels between man's attitudes to disease and an antagonism at the central sort of Greek tragedy, which is the idea of double determination. Is it gods or humans who are to blame? Do gods make things happen, or do we? Does bad air make us sick, or are we bad people? And that's a sort of the decision between internal and external causality is that man versus miasma debate that's sat behind all discussion of disease for most of human history. And indeed, all religions and cultures seem to have a god to blame for disease. The Aztecs had, and forgive me for my pronunciation, I'm going to have to look at this one, Chalchuchtlin, which was a jade turkey that caused disease. The Egyptian god of plague was Reshef, which is also, incidentally, despite only having one god, a Jewish name as well. And the Japanese had Sugawara. My favorite of all was Chanhua Nyangyang, the maiden of heavenly flowers, who was the Chinese god of smallpox. And of course, in Western Europe, we have the White Rider of the Apocalypse, more of whom we will hear from later. The earliest recorded pandemic, and this is my timeline you're going to see gradually revealing, was, as I said, the 430 BC plague of Athens. And the causes of that were unknown at the time. And it did enormous damage to Athenian culture and society, and in fact undermined democracy. It took 15 years for Athens to recover, and poor old Pericles perished during the epidemic. The Plague of Athens here is depicted by Michael Schwertz, I think he's a Flemish painter. I'm going to introduce a few paintings along the way here, just to add a bit of flavour to some of the cartography. And Thucydides, who recorded the Plague of Athens, said, "Words indeed fail one when one tries to give a general picture of this disease, and as for the suffering of individuals, they seem almost beyond the capacity of human nature to endure." And then the catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen next to them, became indifferent to every religion or law, therefore causing the so-called fall of Athens after the plague. Going back to our timeline and staying with our classical world, the plague of Justinian and the Antonine plague. The Antonine plague about 165 AD would appear to have been smallpox, and the plague of Justinian is the first appearance in the classical world of Black Death. Now, the Black Death was far more than a medieval horror. It just kept coming back. For over the next 300 years, from about, more than 300 years, sorry, the next 1500 years, the plague became a regular part of everyday life in Europe. And in fact, Decameron by Boccaccio in 1353, the Black Death is a vital role in the storytell, because 10 people are self-isolating in a villa outside Florence for 2 weeks, and they tell the tales of stories, morality, love, sexual politics, and presumably eat too much chocolate and binge watch illuminated manuscripts. In fact, the word quarantine stems from this period as well. It literally means 40 giorni, 40 days, and that was the Venetian policy founded in 1377 of keeping ships from plague-stricken countries in the lagoon for up to 40 days to assure that no latent cases were on board. And the thought of sitting on a boat in the Venice lagoon for 40 days is not quite so bad as spending 10 days in a Holiday Inn as currently mandated by my government. The Black Death was absolutely crucial to the development of art and culture. And this is one of my very favorite paintings. I grew up, my father had a Hieronymus Bosch in his study, not the original print, I hasten to add. And this is the Triumph of Death in the Prado in Madrid, which is a depiction of the devastation caused by plague. And I just want to bears closer inspection. And just this bottom corner here, I'll actually go back. I mentioned the fourth horseman of the apocalypse. There he is in the middle of this with his scythe, shepherding people into this sort of coffin-like structure, surrounded and corralled by the armies of the dead. But in the bottom left-hand corner, there is the wheel of fortune on the chariot, crushing some poor peasant. And as you can see, the skeleton up here plays a hurdy-gurdy to ridicule the living, holding the thread of life of this poor lady under here, with some scissors about to cut it, like Atropos and the Greek god. And a king here showing that no one is immune, as the song says, rich and poor alike, from the plague. And then, rather gruesomely, this dog eating a baby's face being held by its dead mother. There's all life and death are here. Further in culture, you'll recognize the beak of the plague doctor. This is from 1656, the bubonic plague. This beak actually had a practical purpose. It was to hold a pomander of nice smelling things. The idea being that then you wouldn't ingest the miasma of plague-causing miasma. So the whole story of Europe between the 14th and 17th century was constantly marked by plague. Great artists, including Hans Holbein and Titian, died from it. And indeed, it wasn't until the Great Fire of London in 1666 that we rid ourselves in the British Isles of the plague. And Samuel Pepys in his diary, just before that, said, "This day, much against my will, I did in Drury Lane see 2 or 3 houses marked with a red cross upon the doors. And Lord have mercy upon us, writ there, which was a sad tome, being the first of the kind to my remembrance that I ever saw." Thereby installing the idea of the red cross to represent medical assistance. And then between 1520 and 1600, let's say, the Kochtalitzli epidemic in Mexico, which is kind of the forgotten plague, actually wiped out 15 million people in the Aztec population. And that's after smallpox had probably taken out 8 million. And in fact, between 1520 or 1519, the year of the arrival of the Spaniards, the population of Mexico went from 30 million to 2 million, with smallpox plus the Kochtalitzli plague dealing with the rest. And this is one of the very few contemporary images of the plague affecting Mexico. It had a rather horrible effect of apparently blood pouring out of all sorts of parts of the body. And it's unclear, even to this day, exactly what caused it. There was some reference to a possibility of it being a salmonella, and that's what people tend to think today. And then moving on from that, through the 17th and 18th century plagues, we get to the cholera in the 19th century, about which we are going to discuss a lot. And then in the 20th century, after the First World War, Spanish flu. So the Spanish flu brought unimaginable atrocities. It's really quite hard to get your head around the numbers. There were only about 2.5 billion people on Earth at the time, and 500 million of them were killed. 500 million were infected, and over 100 million were killed. From that perspective, give some sort of perspective to it, that's more than all civilians and soldiers killed during the First World War. And indeed, this is one of the more poignant images. It's Egon Schiele, the Viennese artist, with his wife and unborn child. In his final letter, he wrote to his mother and said, "Edith has got the Spanish flu 8 days ago and has pneumonia. She is 6 months pregnant. The disease is very serious and life-threatening. I'm preparing myself for the worst." She died in her 6th month of her pregnancy, and 3 days later, Egon Schiele died as well. And similarly, Edvard Munch was fell prey to the 1918 flu, and this is the picture of the ravages that he makes on his face, although he did recover. It was a particularly gruesome flu because it affected the young and healthy adults as well as the elderly and infants. And it was only really with the Spanish flu that the notion of the miasma theory met its maker. And in the 20th century, the idea of the germ theory took root. Now, when I say took root, actually, as often in cartography, the Arabs were there first. In 1025, Ibn Sina proposed a germ theory, and Ibn Khatima and Ibn al-Khatib in the 14th century went along with it. However, these views were not accepted within Europe, and it wasn't really until the late 19th and early 20th century that Europeans started to understand that miasma theory was perhaps not as accurate as a germ theory. And it wasn't until 1890 that viruses were discovered. And virus, one of my favorite quotations about virus is Peter Medawar, who said that they are a piece of bad news, very bad news, wrapped up in protein. And so we see, coming through to those of us that can remember, the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which surprisingly killed some 25 to 35 million and is still working its way through the population. And let's continue my art historical tour of pandemics. Here's a Keith Haring print about the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. To bring us up to date, we have SARS, swine flu, Ebola, and then COVID-19 at the bottom, working away. As of March 16th, it was 2.7 million, it's cleared 3 million now. It's really quite a nasty little virus. It's doing very serious damage. And in order to understand viruses, historically, people have attempted to map their effects and to record the damage. And you can see there, in terms of global virus damage, the Black Death is way out ahead of everything else. And then you have smallpox, Spanish flu, Justinian, and HIV/AIDS are pretty serious. And COVID, while still working its way, is a relatively modest virus in historical terms. Now, the first attempt to turn to maps, the first attempt to chart the global distribution of major infectious diseases was Friedrich Schnürer from the University of Tübingen. You don't need to know he's from Tübingen, but I just like saying Tübingen a lot. And he came up with this notion of tracking all known diseases on Earth in 1827. The idea that human agency was bound up with the spread of infection is not lost on Schnürer. And he actually said that man's place in activities changed over time, and so too do the diseases that are to exist. And he plotted on this map all of the diseases that he could spread, but he didn't do it. I mean, it's a very difficult map to understand. He did it in a sort of narrative form. So here we see Asia. He rather regards Southeast Asia as responsible for most diseases here, and lists records of diseases and when they struck and where they struck, including across the top here. There's a disease discovered by Marco Polo, and it includes the swelling of the neck and the legs. And he was very uninclined, although he put some color coding on for yellow fever, which is yellow, and cholera, which is pink. He didn't want to put lines of the diseases because, as he said, man's influence determines the effects of the disease in the area it goes over. So whilst he was very harsh on Southeast Asia, where you guys are in California, he was very kind on. There's not a lot of disease happening in California in 1827. But the one disease he does mention, just south of Monterey, and probably what's about Los Angeles, for those of you that read German, is the schlimmste Form of Lustsäure, which is the worst form of lust disease. I thought you'd appreciate that. And having discussed lust disease, we move on to the next map, which is by a man handily called Valentine Seaman. Now, if you'd have asked me about a month ago what the first epidemiological maps were, and probably if you ask anyone who knows anything about cartography, they would say Dr. John Snow's map of the Soho and cholera in London. But thanks to one Michael Buehler in Massachusetts, we now know that the first epidemiological map and the first use of a spot map was in New York to map the yellow fever outbreak in 1795. And Valentine Seaman did this report, and really it was to deal with an ongoing argument that relates to this whole notion of miasma or the actions of man, but also the notion that your former president was very familiar with, that you can blame foreigners for bringing a disease. And in New York in 1795, people started to notice that yellow fever was attached to ships and people, and the miasmic theory was that the stench of rotting detritus in the harbor of New York was what caused the disease, and it was brought in by foreigners. And so Seaman started a plot and tell the story of each fatal case. And in doing this, he started to plot the movement by date, and you'll see that the text on the right here describes that when certain individuals were sick, and he says that here. You look on the right hand page in the text. He died on the 22nd of the 7th month after a few days' illness with yellow skin and smelled extremely offensive. With his maps, Seaman was trying to answer the common question, which is, are the deadly fevers foreign or of domestic origin? Now, this is a particular area of New York where his two maps, that's his other map there. So the two maps were showing the ports and harbors, and what was happening was there was a great deal of detritus and muck on the slopes that he brought the ships, the slipways where he brought the ships into. And it wasn't until nearly 100 years later that people were able to make the connection between the pools of stagnant water and mosquitoes that were in fact the vectors for the yellow fever. And so Valentine Seaman's central theory in the question he was looking to answer was missing an element, which was that there was in fact a third party, that the miasma was in fact the germ theory, which was carried by the mosquito. Prior to my being educated by Michael Bueler as the first epidemiological maps, I thought the first ones were by Charles Piquet and the rather excellently named Louis-François Benistrin de Chateauneuf, who in 1834 wrote a report of Paris, which ends up actually being the first geospatial information system, as we would now call it, on a map. And this shows Paris and the Department of Seine with the outbreak of cholera in Paris from 1832. And he maps the number of cases and deaths per 1,000 inhabitants. And as a result of this, the French authorities, in order to deal with the cholera epidemic, redesigned the city to take away the notion of people being put close together. And Haussmann's designs for the Étoile of Paris meant the buildings were separated further so that the miasma could not spread. Of course, there's another argument as to why Haussmann did this, which was also to enable the French authorities to stop revolutionary forces, such as those depicted in Les Miserables. In fact, the map and the report by Piquet was so successful that the cholera epidemic was dealt with by the reconfiguration of Paris. Although before that happened, Henrik Heine records that a society masked ball where one of the harlequins stopped dancing, pulled off his mask and revealed a blue-tinged face and died several hours afterwards, along with several other dancers. Now, although the Haussmann's developments to Paris might have something to do with the outbreak of cholera, it also had something to do with crowd control and oppression. And so poor old Jean Valjean and his compatriots had to deal with plague, police, politics, and plutocrats. No wonder they were known as Les Miserables. After the outbreak of plague in London in 1665 and the fire in 1666, Christopher Wren proposed a new design, which you'll see bears a great deal of similarities to Haussmann's designs from 100 years later. But sadly, due to the Crown's impecuniousness, Wren's plans were rejected, and London continued to be rather closely knit and messy in its architecture. But it's worth mentioning that we did at least try to look as beautiful as Paris. As I mentioned earlier, the most famous epidemiological map of all time is John Snow's map from On the Mode of Communication of Cholera, which with each of these black lines that you can see marks individual cases of cholera and deaths in Soho in London, very near my shop, in fact. And he famously identified that the cases were related to a pump, a particular pump, where the residents of Soho were getting their water. And I've done a little bit of field work for you when preparing this talk, which I'll play now.
So here we are next to a modern replica of the pump that would have stood on this spot in John Snow's day, symbolically without its handle, and outside the pub that now bears Dr. John Snow's name. Across the road, you see some houses from the 18th century that would have been here during 1854 epidemic.
Now, the reference to the pump is that having discovered that the pump was the source of the putrid water that was making people ill, they removed the handle and cholera cases dropped. Now, in his pamphlet, he suggested that the the sewage got into the water was the cause of cholera. Now, this was a cause of great public concern, but also of economic interest to the London Water Company, who dug experimental wells outside Watford in order to break the monopoly of the Thames Water and other water authorities at the time. The financial interest for them to do so. They aimed not only to improve the water, but to break those monopolies. Now, at the same time as Snow's foundation of the idea that the cholera bears fecal matter, that the water bears fecal matter, which carries the cholera, there was also an ongoing discussion in Parliament from the medical establishment, Victorian medical establishment, that expanded the idea that it was still an airborne disease. The miasma theory continued, and it was brought about by foul conditions from unsanitary conditions. Now, although Snow was to prove that this was incorrect, the miasmic theory continued for a great deal in the political class. And in fact, it was the miasmic theory that persuaded the government to start improving the hygiene in London. Basil Gett, who devised the Great Sewage System, which London still uses, believe it or not, today, was convinced to do so by this sort of miasmic theory, by the idea it was airborne. And this is the report from 1854 that persuaded him. Interestingly, one of his relatives then started producing Basil Gett television, which brought Big Brother to the world. So it's proof that the same family has been shoveling shit down the tubes for years. The cholera mapping frenzy continued, and we're going to deal with a few of them here. This is just my excuse to show one from my own collection, which is the first map of my old house in Oxford here on Osney Island, which was very fortunate to have a little black dot for a cholera death. And you can see here around the water treatment and the water area, you can see where the River Thames is in Oxford. All of the black deaths all of the black dots are concentrated there in Oxford. People start to think about how cholera is transmitted. And this is a fascinating map by Kiepert to accompany a report on cholera in the Arabian Peninsula. And the report was by a guy called Stekulus. And he considers both the cause of the outbreak and the method of transmission. And interestingly, if you look closely at the map, you will see around Mecca that he's tracking the cholera outbreaks along the routes of pilgrimage. And so the notion of travel and human movement is attaching itself to transmission of disease. And here in India, in Calcutta, a little close up on this, we'll see another epidemiological spot map. Now, the first case of cholera was recorded in India, in Bengal, in 1817, near Calcutta, or Kolkata as it's now known. And local conditions obviously are ideal for an epidemic in India, as sadly we're discovering today. Very densely populated, moist tropical climate with slightly dodgy sanitation. And cholera has lingered in India even to this day. But 1887, which is when this map was made, was not a particularly bad year for cholera. But there's a note on the key, which sadly I forgot to illustrate here, which says that the figures for deaths did not include hospital admissions, which is an interesting comparison with today, where actually in India, all they're counting are hospital admissions. And you can see that in 1887, the notion was the hospital admissions would skew it somewhat, because obviously everyone in hospital was very sick, but these were the ones that didn't make it to hospital. Nowadays, we choose not to count those. Russia, similarly, in the late 19th century, suffered from an extremely bad case of cholera epidemic. And this is one of only a very, very small number of epidemiological maps printed in Cyrillic. Russians not being, even today, very keen on telling stories about diseases affecting their country. This map embraces 2/3 of the Russian Empire only. And the 1892 epidemic of cholera that it shows here was particularly vicious. And Russia has always been very vulnerable due to huge amounts of poverty and low standards of hygiene. And in fact, it was so badly affected that the 1893 epidemic killed over 30,000 people. And if you look closely at the map, you'll see that there's a suggestion by the cartographer Castelli of these so I'm pointing at a map, that's not going to work for you, I'm going to have to do it with the cursor, aren't I? These arrows showing the movement of transmission. And that shows the directions where cases seem to be increasing. The World Organization estimates that 120,000 people a year still die from cholera. So it's not been dealt with at all, not been dealt with totally. At the same time as the cholera epidemic, there were lots and lots of other epidemiological crises, including malaria in particular. And here's a chart by Joseph Minard, the father of statistical cartography, one of my favorite map makers, from 1862, that shows and hints at one of the reasons why there were so many epidemics at the time, which is that we were just moving more. And this is a chart of immigration. We'll come back to the idea of that in a moment. And at the same time as that, the malaria epidemic in India was reaching huge proportions. It was actually the second biggest killer in India after cholera. An estimated 20 million people died from malaria. And although it's already endemic there in the 19th century, beginning of the 19th century, the end of it saw a huge spread of the disease. And the main reason for that, going back to Minard's map, was the British establishment of a railway system and an irrigation and canal network that enabled people and mosquitoes to move more. Also, lack of drainage and basic hygiene caused huge problems. But
there you go. I guess that's 30 minutes.
30 minutes.
This map by the Public Health Commission of India was produced by the British in India to get a better understanding of the disease. And it was actually Sir Ronald Ross, who joined the Indian Medical Service, was responsible for this. And it was in 1897 he demonstrated the life cycle of the malarial parasite and showed that mosquitoes carried it. He got the Nobel Prize in 1902. Just to go back to my art historical points on here, it's worth mentioning Arnold Bocklin, who produced this image of the fourth horseman, but on board the wonderful symbolism of fourth horseman apocalypse, but also on the wings of the epidemic and breathing the foul air from its beak down here. And that was inspired by both the cholera and the malarial epidemics in India in the 1890s. And in an interesting little analogy, Bocklin, of course, came from Basel, whose other great art historical figure, Hans Holbein, had died of plague some years earlier. Now, in 1894, a mysterious outbreak took hold of Hong Kong. And what's fascinating about this one in particular is that, again, an epidemiological spot map going through from 1894 to 1902. And it was a complete mystery as to what was happening. People were getting very, very sick and very large. 2,000 people died and a third of the population emigrated at the time. And as the weather grew cooler, the plague dropped. And then it got warmer again, it came back. And this toing and froing caused enormous consternation. People couldn't work out what was going wrong. And it was one Mr. Dr. Gomez da Silva, who was the medical officer in Macau, who realized that the epidemiology was tracking the rat population and was correlated to the rat population in Hong Kong. And the symptoms of the disease and indeed the pattern of the disease were matched perfectly with the plague of Athens, which was, up until 1905, still a mystery as to what sort of disease it was. And so 2,325 years after the plague of Athens, with which we began our survey, the plague of Hong Kong answered the mystery to this, which was the feed from rats in Hong Kong that was giving the damage. And the reason there were so many rats in the warm month was because the humans were not clearing away rubbish. And so it was human agency, not the pathogen, that was providing conditions for the pathogen to flourish. Which brings us back to the point, was it man or miasma? And where does this leave us in relation to our current pandemic? COVID-19, which is like transmitted through the very air that we breathe. Surely it's like the sort of poster boy or the poster virus for the miasmic theory or the germ theory that it's the virus. Well, indeed, a map of the world with its surface area resized to illustrate COVID deaths up until December 2020 gives us a world with an oversized Europe and North America and Brazil. And a suggestion that the wealthier nations, those who can afford to travel more, like our Indian trains and canals, are more likely to transmit the disease and are more likely to be affected by this novel pathogen. However, if you reconfigure that map to show deaths as a percentage of reported cases, you get a very different picture. We've still got a large blob here for the British Isles. There's a lot of us have died. But if you look there, you've got India and China, and again, sub-Saharan Africa looking altogether larger. Now, for those of us that have seen other maps of the globe resized for certain things, this map looks very familiar. For example, HIV infections worldwide, poverty, access to safe drinking water, no access to electricity, open defecation practices, and illiteracy. And you see that these very, very basic, some might call them human rights, or certain very basic areas of human agency and decisions we make about how we live have a huge effect on the effectiveness or otherwise of a virus to spread within society. And as we see now with cases of coronavirus hitting over 3 million worldwide, you'll see that it's now moved to those same countries that are affected by those other poverty, aspects of poverty and deprivation. That's the end.
Daniel, thank you so much. That was terrific. I'm sure we have questions. If you want to put them in the chat, you can go ahead and we'll watch that. I'll start off. The plague arrow? That was from one of your first slides.
Yeah, Apollo.
What is that?
So the god Apollo, when he was born with his twin sister, and he had to fight off the serpent Python, who was sent to him to kill him by Hera. And precocious little 4-month-old was given a silver bow and arrow, and these bows and arrows were immensely poisonous, and they became the plague arrows. And then when Troy was besieged by the Athenian ships were visited upon by Apollo because Agamemnon treated the Chryseis, the daughter of a priest, with disrespect, and therefore Apollo sent his plague arrows to set a plague among the Athenians. This I all bought for my daughter, by the way, 2 days ago.
Daniel, this is Ron Gibbs.
Hi,
I have
Ron.
a very special interest in your presentation. I'm a physician with a very special interest in the history of medicine, particularly infections, and I wanted to compliment you on how you wove together not only the maps, but the prints and the paintings into a really sweeping tour de force of epidemics throughout history. So congratulations and thank you for presenting it to our society.
Thank you.
Hi, Daniel. This is Eleanor. I just wanted to say thank you so much. This is really the first time I've totally understood the issue of illness and social justice. It's talked about a lot, and seeing those last maps you showed about literacy, electricity access, open defecation, that just drove the point home beautifully to me. So thank you for sharing that and for helping me understand.
Thank you.
Eleanor, could I just add that there's an expression, particularly that comes up during the COVID-19 epidemic, and that's called the social determinants of health. And that's exactly what those last series of maps that Daniel showed depict for us. There is great disparity in illness and disease, and so much of it is underlying conditions of poverty and access to safe drinking water and sewage treatment.
You'd get the similar look, Ron, if you look at vaccines distribution worldwide as well. You'd find a similar pattern, I think, too.
And I mean, that's a fascinating, very contemporary question, which is that we've created this vaccinated first world and an unvaccinated third world, which is basically a great big mutation soup brewing. And you know, if we don't manage to deal with the source of the pathogen before it mutates, then we could be looking exactly where we were this time last year in a year's time.
we're working with, we have a school in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Sao Paulo is not as bad as India right now, but it's been pretty bad for the last couple of months. And looking back at the other photos, you just see how people are like on top of each other. There's no way they can distance, and their living conditions are so bad that they want to get out. And so it just continues to perpetuate the spread of the disease because they don't have the right conditions to live in. And we've been giving water to the communities because they don't have running water, they don't have sanitary latrines and such. So it's really bad in a lot of these places.
And from a historical perspective, it's fascinating to think that actually I missed something that I should have mentioned. The quarantine, which was introduced to Venice in the 14th century, actually came from the Arabian world, and yet again, Arab scientists way ahead of European scientists. And the notion that you have 40 days quarantine, of course, was much easier to enforce in the days of city-state with city walls and very small amounts of travel between people. And even though in the 14th century life was pretty grim and people had pretty poor health and hygiene and literacy and poverty, etc., people were able to contain diseases a lot easier than we are today because people didn't move around so much.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel, congratulations on a wonderful lecture. I'm a physician and I'm very interested in health maps and health books with mapping. I'd like to mention two things. One, that the 40 days is very ancient. It comes from the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, about 40 days of rain, etc. And there are many, many references to 40 days in health going on from there. The other thing I would like to mention is your last 2 or 3 maps from the World Mapper is so current, and it really is the way of thinking. And pretty much medicine do accept that the main problem in the United States is the disparity between various populations and the social conditions in which the poorer or the populations function under relative to the more modern medicine, et cetera, is due to social conditions. And that really is significant.
Yeah, yeah.
Other questions?
I have a question for Daniel. Daniel, this is Ken Habib. Did Jon Snow know about Valentine's semen?
That's a very good question, and it's also new for me. I don't think he did, but so the medical journal that Valentine's semen wrote in was the very first. The medical repository was the very first American medical journal. Now, it's not at all clear that it got to the British Isles for Jon Snow to understand and read, because there's certainly a lot of references in the parliamentary reports from just after Jon Snow stuff about Jon Snow without any relating it to an earlier map. So I think probably not. And he was working very specifically with cholera rather than yellow fever.
Thank you.
It's amazing that report was hiding in plain sight. I mean, if you Google first epidemiological maps, you will find no reference to, well, you might start to do so now, but you certainly a few weeks ago would not find any reference to anything other than Jon Snow as the first spot maps.
Right.
And numerous books that I've read say that, and you have to predate it by nearly 40 years. I mean, it's a big time difference between the two.
Yeah, and then there was Schnurr.
Well, Schnurr is not a spot map. Schnurr is different. I mean, Schnurr is well known about. In fact, Altonen, who's the sort of main authority on epidemiological maps, mentions Schnurr and says it's the most important medical map ever made.
All right. Well, Daniel, thank you again so much for joining us and sharing that presentation with us. That was really wonderful. I put the link to your website in the chat. And we're going to take a break now.